Good evening, everybody. I want to welcome you all to the first event of our spring 2022 Common Word Community Read. My name is Wiley Cash. I am the alumni author in residence here at UNC Asheville. I'm also a proud alumnus of the class of 2000. I'm excited to see one of my fellow alumni, Miriam from that class, here tonight as well. And I know there are dozens of you online. I work here at the university. I teach creative writing and literature, and I also work in the Office of Advancement. And the Common Word Community Read combines both things that I hope to be good at, which are literature and advancement. And in terms of advancement, the way we see this playing a role is advancing UNCA's engagement and involvement in the community. And that's why the word community is so important in the title of this program, the Common Word Community Read. And the folks here at Ollie and the incredible work that you have and the incredible community that you have here on the mountain is a community that we definitely want to be part of. So we deeply appreciate you hosting us here, and for so many of your members joining us in person tonight, and those of you online. So thank you so much for that. The Common Word Community Read brings the UNC Asheville community together to engage in a collective educational experience. Our launch was this past fall. Our first event, we had one person in the audience, and we had two online. Tonight we have a good many of you in the audience, and we have, I think, a couple of hundred registered online. And so stick to it, have a dream, and see it through. The spring selection is The Last Castle, the epic story of love, loss, and American royalty in the nation's largest home by Denise Kiernan. This book came out a couple of years ago. It has continually been one of the bestsellers at Malaprop's in downtown Asheville. It's beat my books. I've had two books come out since this one has been out in the world. It continues to outsell both of them. But I'm a nice guy, so we're hosting Denise anyway. Our first event of the semester is tonight's lecture, What George Vanderbilt Saw, Asheville in the Western North Carolina Mountains, from 1887 to 1888 by Dr. Dan Pierce, Professor of History. I appreciate all of you being here and the hundreds of you who are watching right now in the region, in the state, and around the country. We'll be hosting two more events over the course of this semester, focusing on our text here, The Last Castle. On Tuesday, March 22nd at 7 p.m., right here in this room, we'll be screening the documentary America's First Forest, Carl Schenck and the Asheville Experiment, which is about the Asheville forestry program and the incredible legacy that was left behind by the land and forestry management there at Biltmore. And then on Tuesday, April 26th at 7 p.m., once again back here in this room, this time also virtually, I will be in conversation with author Denise Kiernan. A live stream of that event will be available for folks outside the city and the region. I've already had someone ask me this question tonight. Yes, I did write the notebook under the pen name Nicholas Sparks. The other question that somebody asked is, what is our fall selection for 2022? I'm thrilled to say that our fall selection is the National Book Award winning novel Hell of a Book by North Carolina writer Jason Mott. He just won the National Book Award, and he will be here with us in Asheville, and we will have a number of events in the fall centered around his novel to both celebrate it and to delve deeper into that wonderful book. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I want to thank the folks who worked hard to make this event and the events to come possible. Thank you to Catherine Frank and Lynn Spade for opening the doors to us here and for helping us get the word out. Ollie might be the answer to everything. Instead of the easy button, it should just be Ollie. Like, just call Ollie and people will come. And they will make it work well. I want to thank also Vice Chancellor Kirk Swinson for letting me run with what began as his idea. I want to thank Kevin Fuller for running the tech and taking care of this live stream here tonight. I also want to thank Colleen O'Neill in the Alumni Office for working so hard and so diligently, and also never getting frustrated with me no matter how many questions I ask. And I ask a lot of questions. One of them is always, is it going to be okay? And Colleen always says yes, and I appreciate that. I also want to remind folks that we're going to give away 2 copies of The Last Castle tonight to folks who register for this event, either in person or online. So stick around until the end of the event. This is just like class. Now that you're sitting down, you can't leave. That includes the folks on the live stream. And we'll announce the winner of these 2 books, 2 individuals, at the end of tonight's event. So I am so proud and honored to introduce my friend and former professor, Dr. Dan Pierce. He's a professor of history here at UNC Asheville. His research interests include environmental issues in Southern Appalachia, NASCAR, moonshine, and race relations. I knew that was going to get a laugh. I structured that purposefully to build up to that laugh. And his published books include Corn from a Jar, Moonshining in the Great Smoky Mountains and Hazel Creek, The Life and Death of an Iconic Mountain Community. He is currently at work as one of the founders of the Rail Project, which researches the role incarcerated laborers had in building Western North Carolina's railroads. And I want to say real quick before I bring Dr. Pierce to the stage that I tell people when it comes to my first novel that UNCA taught me how to write in the literature and creative writing department, and the history department gave me something to write about. So I want to introduce the person who gave me something to write about, Dr. Dan Pierce.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I don't know when I've spoken before real people. I've been Zooming so much, but it's great to be here and great to be a part of this. And of course, in I guess it was 2000, I taught the first Appalachian history class on this campus, and out of that class we had a New York Times best-selling author. We've had a Grammy Award-winning bluegrass musician. We've had well, it was just an amazing group, and so it's been great to see the wonderful things that they've done. It's one of the really nice things about teaching and being around for a long time, Merritt, and and being able to watch these people grow up and do wonderful things. So that's been great. But again, it's good to be here tonight and talk about this. This is as I put it, while he was kinder, people ask me, what I do. What kind of history do you do? And I have a good friend who is Asheville native, wonderful poet by the name of Michael McPhee, who's at Chapel Hill. And Michael put it this way one time. He said, "Pierce, you're UNC Asheville's resident professional hillbilly." And I said, "Well, I'm not going to argue with you." I really can't. But again, so I'll kind of put that hat on and talk a little bit about maybe some hillbillies, but also some other things as Asheville kind of moves from the hillbilly town to the Paris of the South. But anyway, in the context of this book, I want to talk about what George Vanderbilt saw when he came to Asheville. Now, there is some debate here, and I kept seeing references because Kiernan writes in here about what she evidently thinks is Vanderbilt's first visit, which was in May of 1888 when he came with his mother to Asheville. There are other folks that say he came earlier. Now I'll say I tried to find evidence that he had come earlier, and I couldn't find anything about that. So I would, if someone has evidence that he was here before that trip in 1888, I'll be glad, and I'm not going to say definitively that the May 1888 trip was his first, but I'm going to stick with Kiernan on this. And again, I searched the Asheville Citizen for notices that he had been in Asheville, and if someone like Vanderbilt came to town, they'd usually make the papers, and there's no mention of that. And I see people saying that he was here, but I don't see evidence that he was here. So anyway, but the evidence we do have is that he was here in May of 1888. In fact, in the Asheville Citizen. And one of the things I'm going to do is kind of look at Asheville during this period, partly through Vanderbilt's eyes and partly through the eyes of the Asheville Citizen, assuming that Vanderbilt was sitting on the veranda of the Battery Park Hotel looking at the Asheville Citizen. So we'll assume that. Whether he did or not, I can't say. But anyway, in the Asheville Citizen in February of 1888, there was this piece. We learned that Mr. George Vanderbilt and family of New York have engaged a suite of rooms at the Battery Park and will arrive about May 1st. It is their intention to spend the summer in our mountain metropolis. And so this is the first notice. Now, according to Kiernan, he came with his mother, who was suffering, quote, the lingering effects of a bout of malaria. And she was treated here by Dr. Samuel Westray Battle, who was a noted pulmonologist, who had come to Asheville in about 1885. I'll talk a little bit more about him later. So while she was being treated for these lingering effects of malaria, Vanderbilt relaxed on the veranda of the Battery Park or hired a horse to explore the area. So Kieran doesn't say, and we don't know exactly how long they stayed, but evidently it was an extended visit. So we're going to look at some of the things that Vanderbilt saw, must have seen during his exploration, what he might have perused in the Asheville Citizen. He sat on the veranda, and what he might have thought about some of these things, and what might have prompted him to decide to build here. So, the first thing, Vanderbilt, of course, arrived in Asheville by rail, in his own private rail car. And he would have come up what's some people refer to as the Shenandoah grade. You come up that way frequently between Old Fort and Ridgecrest, the top of the mountain there. What you may not know, and this is a section of that railroad, what you may not know, you got to kind of picture if you see where it says straight line there, distance between MP 13, blah, 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 all that line at the bottom here, that is roughly the route of I-40 there. So to the north from there is the route of the Shenandoah grade. And so you see there from Henry Station on the right there up to the Shenandoah Tunnel, which is at Ridgecrest. It's about, 3.4 miles as the crow flies there. That's about 9 miles of track there. It is one of the most amazing engineering feats ever. And, took incredible amount of work. It took a lot of imagination. You can see all the switchbacks that are there. There's 7 tunnels in that stretch of railroad. There are people from all over the world, and until you've gotten into the world of railroad buffs, you haven't been in the world of buffs. I mean, they are intense and obsessive, and but people from all over the world come. Particularly, they haven't done it in recent years. The Transportation Museum down in Spencer near Salisbury would periodically run a steam train through there. And when they did that, I mean, thousands of people came out there, lined the bridges and the tracks and everything else. And But again, this is something that attracts attention. In particular, you can see where it says Round Knob there. And then it has, that's actually the old side of Andrews Geyser. In the middle of that, well, it's an area where there are three loops. So at the bottom it loops, goes up over the top, and then makes another loop to gain the mountain there. So again, it's a fascinating area. And so Vanderbilt would definitely have noticed this, because you weren't just rolling along because of all the switchbacks and the tunnels that the train had slowed tremendously. And so this would have been Vanderbilt's introduction to Western North Carolina at this time. Now, in connection with that, and possibly the construction was over. Actually, this was completed. This stretch of track was completed by 1879. The train arrived in Asheville for the first time in 1880. And so Asheville did not have train service until 1880. This is 1888 when Vanderbilt comes. Took about 3 years to build this stretch of track. Now, most historically, what people have heard about that construction has talked about James Wilson, who was the chief engineer, and the marvels that he accomplished in constructing this, including Swannanoa Tunnel, as it says there, 1,832 feet. One of the, if not the longest tunnel east of the Rockies. Wilson decided it would go faster if they dug from both ends. They hauled a locomotive up and over the mountain to facilitate taking the material out as they blasted out that tunnel. Now, and you look at that and you say, how did they accomplish that in the 1870s? Well, the answer is convicts from the North Carolina State Penitentiary. This was a state project. Zeb Vance was governor. He was determined that this project was going to go through, and they'd move heaven and earth to do that. North Carolina was virtually broke at this time. They didn't have a lot of money. They couldn't hire workers to do this type of work, but and this was not an uncommon thing. If you know much about the history of the period, that they used incarcerated labor for these projects. So there were somewhere in the neighborhood of about 3,000 of these individuals. Now, when Vanderbilt came through, there's a possibility that he witnessed these men in overwhelmingly African American, 90-something% African American, in these striped uniforms along the way doing track maintenance and repairs at that time. But the construction had been completed. And of course, this has been my life recently, has been working with the Rail Memorial Project to bring attention to the sacrifice of these individuals. We know, thanks to the research of a UNCA history student who went into the penitentiary records, that in constructing between 1877 and 1879, in constructing that stretch of railroad, that at least, and this is in the penitentiary records in the state archives, that at least 139 of these individuals died in the process. Countless others were seriously injured or suffered serious illness because of the conditions in the camp. The allocation for food, clothing, housing, that type of thing was about 6 cents a day. And you can imagine. In addition, one of our board members, Ann Chesky Smith, who's the head of the Western North Carolina Historical Association, came across this piece in the Asheville Citizen in 1878, which when I read it, it just chilled me to the bone. So I'll read it to you. On the line of the Western North Carolina Railroad towards Asheville from the tunnel. 3 stockades are to be built for convicts, and 700 are to be sent immediately. The supply of convicts at the penitentiary is not sufficient, and this is the key point right here. And word will be sent out to the prosecuting officers to bring before the courts a larger number of offenders. Most of those offenders, their offense was vagrancy, or offenses under what we call pig laws, which gave extreme penalties for minor theft and things like that. Most of the time, these individuals were rounded up. They were generally young men who were moving about the area without visible means of support, looking for new opportunities. They were not from around here. They were rounded up, hauled into court, and again on very specious charges were convicted and sentenced to 3 years of hard labor, which in many cases became a death sentence. So this was something that Vanderbilt probably saw along the way. I will give a quick advertisement. If you'd like to know more about this, you can go to www.therailproject.org, and I'll just share very quickly. This past weekend we did dedicate a memorial at Andrews Geyser back in October, which we're very excited about doing that, and it's a really, I think, beautiful memorial. And we kind of thought we were done. Turned out that wasn't true. This past weekend we spent 3 days working with a team of experts using human remains detection dogs and ground penetrating radar. Now, I never thought I'd be using those terms, particularly as a historian, but it was an incredible experience. All 3 days, the dog alerted to what they alert to are the chemicals emitted by decomposition of human remains. And so we have pretty much at least have a pretty solid idea. We'll come back with more teams of dogs and use ground penetrating radar to, so everything we're going to do is non-invasive. We're not going to dig folks up or anything like that, but we have pretty much conclusively demonstrated what we had suspected all along, that stretch of railroad is a mass graveyard. Now, Vanderbilt was not aware of that, I don't believe, but again, it was part of the experience for people coming into Asheville and going through western North Carolina during this time period. Well, when Vanderbilt got to Asheville in May of 1888, he saw a number of things. And one of the things he saw was that Asheville was a growing and changing town. Get back to my notes here. And it was really in transition from being a cow town to what it was later termed by the 20th century, early years of the 20th century, as the Paris of the South. The population grew from about 2,600 in 1880, when the railroad finally got to Asheville, to almost 10,000 by 1888. So explosive growth in a very short period of time. By the 1920s, Asheville was the second largest city in North Carolina, behind Wilmington, at over 50,000 people. This is what's called Court Square in 1890, and you can see there's still an element of the cow town there with Asheville. There's another picture, I think a year later, or maybe so, that shows the same area and a bunch of wagons, but it also shows behind it the new electric streetcars that had come to Asheville. And so Asheville, and again, it was very much in transition. when Vanderbilt came. Again, you know, one of the first, I think the second city in the United States to have electric streetcars, you know. So again, a city on the move, but a city still steeped in its past in many ways. Another thing that Vanderbilt saw when he got here was the growing influence of influential, I guess for lack of a better word, outsiders, or people who had come to the region. And in particular, there were 3 individuals who had come to the region before Vanderbilt and settled at least part-time here, who were very influential in shaping the city. And they were George Pack, familiar with Pack Square, Edwin Carrier, who acquired much of West Asheville. It was not part of the city at that time. And of course the Carrier name lives on there. He also owned the Sulphur Springs Hotel, which is now right behind, the site of that is right behind the Department of Motor Vehicles, the driver's license office in West Asheville, if you're familiar with that. There's still some evidences of that place. There was even a golf course back there back in the day. And then the other person who was very influential was Frank Cox. And we'll talk more about Cox here. So again, this is what Vanderbilt saw, again, in terms of this city in transition. You know, some of the streets bricked, some of them with a little bit of a hardened surface, some of them dirt at this point. So it was, again, a place in transition. It was also already, and the roots of this go way back, but it was a resort town. And it was growing in importance as a resort town. And in particular, in 1886, Frank Cox built the Battery Park Hotel. And this is the Battery. This is not the same Battery Park. E.W. Grove would later buy the Battery Park, tear it down, bulldoze the hill, which went to fill in a gully that later became Cox Avenue. But you know, that was a criminal act, I think. You know, would that we had this hotel sitting well above the Asheville skyline at the time. But this is where Vanderbilt came and stayed, and sat on the veranda and looked out his window. Particularly, I think he was on the south side of the building, looking out toward Mount Pisgah. But the hotel, let me read you from Nan Chase's book, and this is a quote about or her take on the Battery Park Hotel. The hotel had everything modern: bathrooms with hot and cold running water, electric light bulbs, steam radiators, a fireplace for every room, ballrooms and dining rooms, a bowling alley, billiard rooms, even one for members of the fair sex to enjoy on their own, and an unusual hydraulic elevator that used a column of water to raise and lower the passenger compartment. This is Otis that built the elevator. The Edison electric lamps were still novel at the time and a great selling point for technically savvy visitors who could now equate the furnishings at the Battery Park with those of the Waldorf in New York City. The Battery Park Hotel had 276 of the new lamps in all. By day, visitors played long games or took jolly horse-drawn stagecoach excursions, riding in a so-called tally-ho into the nearby wilderness. By night, the Battery Park Hotel shone from within as high society came together for formal dinners and seasonal balls. Here was Asheville Ascendant, the Paris of North Carolina, the Saratoga of the South. So again, you know, this demonstrates how Asheville was on the move here. By 1890, there were 47 hotels and innumerable boarding houses in Asheville. So it is a resort community, particularly, and it had attracted people. Sulphur Springs goes back to the 1830s. You also had the Warm Springs, which is now Hot Springs, major hotel there. You know, there were several of these. East Flat Rock, the second homes of Charlestonians going back to the 1790s. And so Asheville had attracted people from the outside, but it really came into its own with the coming of the railroad once again. Another thing that Asheville brought were people like George Vanderbilt's mother, suffering in particular from respiratory ailments, most notably from tuberculosis. This time tuberculosis was the #1 killer in the United States, and a major problem. They weren't quite sure, but in Asheville you had a number of the leading world's experts settled in Asheville, at least for a while, believing in something called climatotherapy. One of the first of these sanitarium was built by Dr. H.P. Gatchell, and that's his picture there, in an ad in the Asheville Citizen for some sort of cure that he had, and there are all these testimonials. The papers were full of these types of things, these kind of testimonials there about these cures. So Gatchell built the first sanitarium called the Villa in Kenilworth in 1871. The National Park Service asserts it was the first tuberculosis sanitarium in the United States, so devoted solely to the treatment of tuberculosis. And so very quickly Asheville became, and again, when the railroad comes, it booms as well. In 1885, Dr. Samuel Westray Battle came to Asheville. Battle was helped to really publicize both this climatotherapy and Asheville as an ideal place for the treatment of tuberculosis. In fact, the Vanderbilts may have heard about a recent paper that Battle had given entitled Climate and the Climatic Treatment of Disease, with special references to the merits of the Asheville Plateau, where he wrote in that article, "Let us briefly sum up Asheville's atmospheric advantages without bestowing indiscreet or overzealous praise. Asheville's climate is preeminently a suitable one for the early stages of pulmonary phthisis." I think that's how I don't know. I have no idea how that's pronounced. But anyway, especially for such subjects as can and will get out in the air and are determined to take benefit of the dry, tonic, invigorating, bracing qualities thereof and keep good hours. Conditions which seem to favor germ propagation and prolong the species of the genus Bacterium do not exist here. And so Battle, very well connected throughout the nation in elite circles again, and he is the one that treated Mrs. Vanderbilt. In 1887, the year before Vanderbilt comes, Dr. Carl von Ruck comes to Asheville, and I may be wrong about this, but I think the location of the Wynia Sanitarium was roughly in the area where the Chancellor's house is now, and there was a dairy farm there as well. So Dr. von Ruck was internationally known and also brought large numbers of people, and again, this becomes a major industry in many ways. In fact, boarding houses filled up with tuberculosis patients seeking treatment, which created kind of a dilemma. You know, how do you have a resort town, or they do refer to as a health resort, but you know, having people with highly communicable, deadly illness next to tourists is a little strange. And there was always this tension in Asheville between those two groups. And in fact, some of the boarding houses, Julia Wolf would send young Thomas down to the train station, and he would hand out cards for the Old Kentucky Home, her boarding house, and it said on the cards, no consumptives. And others were not quite so delicate, I guess it would say, and there would be signs in front of boarding houses and hotels and stuff that would say no lungers. And so that was the kind of derogatory term used for tuberculosis patients at the time. So it was a real dilemma that later would be at least partially solved by E.W. Grove, who was able to push through a law in Asheville which sent all the tuberculosis sanitariums out of the city limits. Which is why, when I was a kid growing up, we had these massive abandoned, we call them haunted houses, that we would regularly get run out of by the police, that were very dangerous and had hypodermic needles laying around and all kinds of stuff, and dumb waiters that we would ride in and stuff like that. But they were former tuberculosis sanitarium that had been abandoned. And all those have been torn down now, but there were a number of those in West Asheville because West Asheville was outside the city limits. But again, this is part of what brought Vanderbilt and many other people who came as well. Blake Grove's wife came for treatment of some sort of respiratory ailment as well for the first time. Another thing that might be surprising, Asheville was a logging town. In many ways. In fact, those individuals, well, George Pack and Edward Carrier were both made a lot of money in the logging business. And it was a little different type of thing. But you see this ad here that you can read, and this is, they're looking for poplar logs enough to make 5 million feet of lumber, put on the bank of the French Broad River. Now what this is about, this was, you really had, this is the early stage when Vanderbilt comes of major commercial logging in this area. Now the attraction, this was the attraction, these old growth hardwood forests in the area. And in particular at this point, what folks have told me is not a poplar, technically it's a tulip tree, but they are still referred to by most folks as poplars, but they were huge. The ability to transport those was limited. So what they would do at this time were to cut these trees in the watershed near streams. And then float them. They would chain them together in what they call rafts and float them to a mill. So this was something that was happening. So most of the cutting at this time were along stream and river banks where these and the tulip tree was a valuable hardwood for a variety of reasons, but also it floated well. And so that was why that really attracted them. Now later, of course, they'll have the narrow gauge railroads, and they will run railroads into every hollow and to the peak of every mountain in western North Carolina. Very little old growth left. But at this time, western North Carolina was on the verge of the boom. Now, one of the ironies here, and again, Vanderbilt would have seen this and seen the rafts and logs floating down the French Broad River. How he reacted to this personally, I don't know, but one of the things that, of course, Vanderbilt, and will be, I think, the next session, would be that Vanderbilt is very much responsible for the start of scientific forestry, or scientific forest management in the United States. And of course, he hired, one of his first hires was young Gifford Pinchot, who would later become the first head of the USDA Forest Service. So this was something that Vanderbilt would have seen as well. And of course, one of the things like Pack and Cox and Carrier, as someone coming in looking for a way to make living in this area pay, and one of the ways that Frederick Law Olmsted had told Vanderbilt to do was to manage his forest and make it pay. And so that's what the Biltmore Forest School is all about, that we'll be talking about the next time. But this is something that Vanderbilt would have seen at this time. Another thing Vanderbilt would have witnessed was that Asheville was a very racially divided town. Post-Reconstruction race relations everywhere in the South, but in Asheville as well, were rather complicated as well. There were some things that spoke to possibilities for perhaps not total civil rights, but some rights for African Americans. But racism was something that was very much open and present, as you can see from the name of this bar, the White Man's Bar in Asheville. And so race was something that was very much in the forefront during this time period. Discrimination was very clear. We weren't yet into the period of the white supremacy campaign in North Carolina and the dramatic rise of lynchings and Wilmington coup and all that, but race relations were tense in many ways. The Democratic Party at this point had been restored to dominance in North Carolina, and it was a party of white supremacy. Now, in the face of that, in Asheville, one of the things that Vanderbilt would have witnessed is that you had a very creative group of individuals who decided that if they were not going to be welcome in that world, would create a world of their own. And so there were some very significant community leaders in the African American community: Isaac Dixon, builders Matt and James Baxter Mason, and builder James Vester Miller, the Reverend Robert Rumley of the Mount Zion Baptist Church, and educator Professor Edward Stevens. You may recognize some of those names. And one of the things that they did, and I hope this will be published soon, we had a really talented, bright history major who did her senior thesis just last semester on the development of the Eagle Market Street area and the East End in this period. And I'm stealing stuff from her here, but it was a time when that area was being developed, and Vanderbilt would have witnessed that. There were some possibilities again for improved rights for African Americans during this time period. In 1887, Isaac Dixon was appointed to the first Asheville City School Board, but he only had served 1 year. All the other school board members were reappointed by the Board of Aldermen, but Dixon was not for 1888. But again, there was a determination to create a world of their own in many ways, and really centered on that Eagle Market Street, East End area there. And so Vanderbilt must have seen this, been aware of it. You know, it's hard to define people's attitudes on race at this time, but Vanderbilt, in terms of the majority of Ashevilleans, would have been seen as progressive for sure. And his lawyer, and I was going to write this down, I couldn't, or look this up, I can't remember his first name. His last name was McNamee. I think helped push him in this direction. Darren Waters' dissertation is on a lot of this. He had access to the archives at the Biltmore estate, and did some incredible research there. But Vanderbilt ended up, was approached by leaders in the African American community and made a loan of, when he came to Asheville in 1893, he made a loan of $15,000. People say, well, Vanderbilt gave the money. He did not. It was a loan, and he loaned the money to the community to build what many of you are familiar with as the YMI, or the Young Men's Institute, which of course is still there in the corner of Eagle and Market Streets to this day. Now, one of the things in terms of looking at Vanderbilt's attitudes and what he brought to Asheville was that he was very much a believer in what was referred to then as racial uplift. Magnum, in a letter to the directors at the YMI, wrote in a letter, he said that the institution should be, quote, controlled exclusively by colored men, and it would basically give them the opportunity to, quote, demonstrate their ability to learn the art of self-government. So we're going to give these folks an opportunity here to basically demonstrate that they are worthy of equal rights, eventually, maybe, kind of, sort of. But again, you know, Vanderbilt would have been seen as a progressive at this point. So again, that's part of the world that Vanderbilt would have witnessed. A community that was, at this time, later, you know, people would look on it as a blighted community, but it was a relatively new community at this time. And again, you had some very important and energetic leaders whose names you still see around Asheville today. Well, in the end, though, what ultimately brought Vanderbilt back to Asheville, of course, his fingerprints are still all over the town in so many ways. But what brought Vanderbilt back? We know what brought him here in the first place, but what brought him back and made him decide that here was where he wanted to make his mark and to build his grand home. And for most accounts, and I'll give you a hint here that I took this afternoon, a little blurry because I tried to zoom in there and my camera's not very good on my thing. That's what happens when you get a hand-me-down phone from your 96-year-old mother. Tell you something about my technological abilities here. So this is what Kieran writes here about George left his mother to relax and breathe deep the curative atmosphere while he took in the exquisite vistas the hotel offered. And now again, there weren't all these lights and wires and stuff like that, from the veranda of the Battery Park Hotel as Vanderbilt is looking. I tried to get as close as I could to what Vanderbilt would have seen, and obviously he would not have seen this stuff in the foreground here. And there was a nice park around the outside of the Battery Park. So, and again, it's 100 feet higher than it is today. The hill was there. That's when he saw her, Pisgah. George found her to be simply stunning, standing proud among her neighbors, nestled in the crook of their slopes. The peak beckoned him with her silent grace. She had seen much in her time here, and age had perhaps rendered her softer, but she retained a stature and eloquence that captivated George. And Moses went up from the plains of Moab unto the mountain of Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, that is over against Jericho. Of course, this was where Moses, if you know the story in Exodus, this is where Moses was able to go and glimpse. He was not allowed to go into the promised land, but he was able to see it from Mount Pisgah. If Moses viewed the promised land from atop Pisgah, then so did this dreamer from a faraway northern island see promise in this ancient mount on the other side of the world from its biblical namesake. Promise for the kind of life he believed he wanted for his vision. Was this the promised land then? These peaks and valleys dotting the banks of the French Broad River? If so, then this heavenly kingdom was fit to house a castle. So, I'll leave the closing words to Denise, and thank you for hearing me.
You want to take questions?
Sure. Yeah, any questions? Danny?
This was a town that was supposed to cure tuberculosis, but isn't malaria a different kind of disease? That's not an airborne disease, it's more...
Yeah, well, part of the it's a little, but it's respiratory, I guess there's a respiratory component to it. I'm not sure. At this time, too, Battle had people convinced that he could treat people for the effects of malaria, so people came for that as well. But again, and part of the thing, of course, so many people summered who were, who lived in malarial environments, and they left those in the summer. That's part of Asheville's appeal, and the advertising that went on is that, there are no mosquitoes here. There was, you see that in a lot of the things, so it's an escape from malaria. But that didn't last, and that whole notion is a place to come get treated for malaria, but tuberculosis is. But Battle had evidently convinced folks that it was a good place to come for the treatment of malaria, at least for the Vanderbilts.
And when you get right down to it, breathing good air doesn't cure tuberculosis either.
No, it's not a good place for the treatment of tuberculosis. For one, you kept reading in some of these things about the dry environments. Where was the environment that different back in the 1880s? I don't think so. They call it the Blue Ridge for a reason. It's the humidity here. So humidity is not good. And so, of course, they eventually figured out that if you want a good environment for something like tuberculosis, you go to Arizona. But they solved it, and people believed it, and here are these world famous experts, like Battle and Carl von Ruck, they were world famous individuals, and sold that idea. So, science changes, as we well know, in recent years. But yeah, this was something that was very much. It's a really interesting thing because of all the tensions, that come along with it. It's a big source of income, but it's also, creates a strange kind of situation when you're also trying to attract tourists as well.
Where did the train stop in Asheville? And can you talk a little bit about George Vanderbilt opening a train station in Biltmore Village?
I don't know why, but the train station at the time was down in what's now the River Arts District. Is it Dave Steele? Is it Dave Steele that's there? Mm-hmm. So kind of across, I don't know what that road is right there.
Meadow?
That's, okay, I'll take your word for it, but on the other side it was torn down. The depot was still there when I was a kid. There was still passenger service when I was a kid in Asheville, believe it or not. But it was, I don't know when it was torn down, but that whole area became pretty blighted in many ways. And so, and it's, that area, it's, a fair distance. I don't know how many miles it is between there and the Biltmore station. But you know, Vanderbilt being Vanderbilt, he would have wanted his own station, you know, for, and of course they're bringing a lot of stuff through there for the construction of the house, and Vanderbilt, you know, wanted his guests to arrive in style, you know, right there near the entrance to the estate. And so, you know, that's my speculation, at least, as to why he would have built his own, you know, as part of his village there. You know, you should have a train station, and so he was able to afford it and to had the influence to get the tracks run through there. But again, the Asheville station was on down the line, going towards the north there. Yes.
Was part of the treatment for tuberculosis the thought behind a lot of the Montford porches? I think
Yes.
they kept them outside, even though
Yeah,
they
as you saw or heard in that paper from Battle, you know, he talked about, you know, being out, and so they kind of, a lot of these places kind of had parks and, you know, nice grounds to walk around, but they all had these big porches, and a lot of people slept on those porches as well. And so that was a big feature, you know, that of the, again, from my childhood. I actually lived in West Asheville, I lived between two of these, and they were huge, these old tuberculosis sanitaria. They had these big porches all around, and that was an important thing, to be out and out in the fresh air. You know, that was the idea. Of course, this was before, you know, anything like Inca or, you know, long-time Asheville people will we actually had a student that did her senior thesis on Inca last semester, and I said, well, you know, you got to have somewhere in there, you know, Inca Stinka. That's what everybody said, you know, and if you remember but you can still get a whiff of it if you drive by Canton, you know, a paper mill. But you didn't have a lot of industry at that time in Asheville, and so, again, that was a big feature right there. But yeah, they had these big porches all around these sanitarium.
Did Vanderbilt consider any other places than Asheville, or just land here and he knew it when he saw it?
I'm sure he did, but I don't know. You know, I mean, of course, it is a little, I mean, it's very different if you think about his social set and where they're building houses. And of course, the, you know, the logical place was more somewhere like, Rhode Island, what's the? Newport, yeah, and actually there is a Vanderbilt mansion there at Newport, you know, or you know, maybe, you know, somewhere in Maine or something like that. But you know, part of what he wanted though was somewhere where you could be out and about year round, and so that was one of the things that he talked about and people talked about as one of the attractions of Asheville. Was that you know, it wasn't like Maine or Rhode Island where you're going to have, you know, a foot of snow around much of the time. But you know, that you could be out and about and in the outdoors much of the year. And so that was part of the attraction there. So.
And wasn't the land extremely cheap?
Well, you know, people think of the Biltmore estate, and you know, when Vanderbilt was through purchasing land, he had somewhere in the neighborhood of about 125,000 acres. So the Biltmore estate at that time stretched from where it is today, or that part of the estate, up along what's now the Blue Ridge Parkway, including Mount Pisgah, and Vanderbilt had a hunting lodge up there, all the way over into the Pink Beds, all the way to Looking Glass Rock there. So all of that was Vanderbilt, was part of his estate, which they later, well, some people say, you know, like to say, well, you know, Edith Vanderbilt gave that land to the Forest Service. No, she sold it to the Forest Service, because George was not very good at earning money, but he was incredibly talented at spending it. And so by the time that he died, there wasn't much left in the bank, and so she was pretty desperate for money, and so she sold most of the estate to the Forest Service at that point.
We have a question from the live stream.
Okay.
Can you verify the story of Vanderbilt wanting to buy the property where Fernhurst now sits and the Colonel wouldn't sell?
I don't know anything about that. That's on the opposite side of the Swanno River, so I'm not, I mean, he may have, but it's hard to kind of picture what that area would have been like at that time, and I don't know. I know where they're talking about that property is on the Ivy Tech campus, but I don't know about Vanderbilt's interest in purchasing that property on the other side of the Swanno River and then towards Asheville. But lots of stories about what Vanderbilt may or may not have done during that time period. Many of them generated during the time as well. They were always kind of suspicious about what was going on up there. That's it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pierce. I kept thinking during this how fortunate I felt to be in a place like Asheville and be on a campus like this and have people like Dr. Dan Pierce share this kind of information with me. It felt good to be in a room with all of you and have somebody tell me interesting things. It feels like it's been a while since that happened. So thank you. I say that knowing I taught in person last semester, and I doubt my students were thankful that there was somebody telling them, because they probably weren't as interested in what I was saying as I was in what Dan was saying. But to jump off some things he said there at the end about the land, we're going to be screening the documentary about the forestry program that Carl Shanks started. Well, we're going to screen that March 22nd. It's a Tuesday evening at 7 p.m. right here back in this room. You will find more information about that. That will not be shown online concurrently with the live event. That will be an in-person event. But Carl Shank was one of the first ones to really see the writing on the wall as far as George Vanderbilt's low coffers. He realized how much money George Vanderbilt was spending pretty early on and had serious doubts about whether or not it was sustainable. So I'm sure we'll talk about that on March 22nd. I want to announce the winners of our giveaway. Our winners are Rebecca Bringle and Abigail Bordeaux. So if they are still watching, we will be reaching out to y'all. If you're not here, I don't think you're here, because you would have jumped up like Price is Right and run down here screaming. And I've got the skinny microphone, so it would have been perfect, like Bob Barker. But we'll get a hold of your emails and make sure you get these books. We'll get them sent out to you. We also have a hold of y'all's emails, and we are going to send you the link to our homepage for the Common Word Community Read. It features discussion questions. It's got lists of all upcoming events. It features interviews with author Denise Kiernan, as well as some reviews of the book. So be on the lookout for that. It'll be your one-stop spot for all Common Word information. So, in closing, thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you to Kevin for running the live stream. Thank you for everybody at home across the country who joined us tonight. Be safe getting home, and thank you to Dr. Dan Pierce for a fascinating